one thing we learn from history is that however far back you look through the past, people then were always looking back over their shoulders. We do define ourselves by where we've come from or where we think we've come from. And that's why I think, particularly in the dangerous and changing world we're in today, it's really important for all of us who actually do live in this continent, for whom it is home, to look at this anew, to take stock of actually where do we come from, how do we connect. And I think there is perhaps a subtext because, the people who come here, and they have come here over millennia, they've had a reason for coming. And, if people want to be here, then that makes them European in my view.
What makes a European? Is it being white, Christian, into football? Is it simply having the good fortune not to be born American? The boundaries of Europe have never been easy to define. I mean, sure, westwards, it's obvious. You've got a great honking Atlantic Ocean over there. But eastwards, you just find yourself shading into Asia, not really knowing where that started. It was the ancient Greeks who set the boundary at the Hellespont, but that's only because the Persians kept trying to cross it. Roderick Beaton's new book, Europe, A New History, takes us from the Battle of Marathon thousands of years ago right through to the present day. And throughout each chapter, he's examining how kings and emperors and politicians and, yes, historians have tried to define a coherent idea of Europe into existence to serve a variety of purposes. I don't think that I can do this fascinating read much justice in the form of an introduction, so take my word for it and watch the interview. Roderick Beaton, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us. I've got to say, I had immense fun reading this book. And I'd like to see someone who's doing some really serious research and making a serious argument also have fun with the way in which they wrote the prose.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that, and I hope readers will take the same view, because I start out from the principle that history is a story, and it needs to be written as a story. It's not just a catalogue of facts. AI can do that. What we do is we write stories.
Well, I want to get into the father of history or father of lies in a minute, but one of the things that struck me when I was reading the introduction is that fairly early on you make a pretty big statement, and it's this. It's Europeans, now as in the past, at the most basic level, must surely be defined as all those people who have made their home in Europe, wherever they may have come from, or however long ago their ancestors arrived. Now, there's going to be some people spitting feathers about that. Did you have the contemporary far right in your mind when you said that?
Well, I mean, let's not sort of target it too closely, but you're right, of course, and thank you for getting my words so exact, because they were actually pretty carefully weighed. I didn't want to make certainly nowhere party political kind of argument. It's not that kind of book, but I mean, I've been thinking all my adult life really about what it means to be European, and it seems to me that the more you read about the history, I mean, there's various obvious ways you can't define European, and it's not race, it's not territory, it's not any of the sort of obvious things. And I came up with this. And actually, it's all of us who live here. And I did think it was important to put that in wherever we came from, because again, if someone reads through the 400 odd pages of the book, you will find that who we, in inverted commas, Europeans are, has constantly kept changing, because people have been arriving on this continent, ever since the remotest prehistory. And, of course, with colonization and then decolonization, I think I said something, Europe went out to the world and, good heavens, the world came to Europe. And, that's a perfectly reasonable expected consequence. So, yes, it's all of us who are here. And I think there is perhaps a subtext because, people who come here, and they have come here over millennia, they've had a reason for coming. And, if people want to be here, then that makes them European in my view.
I was really fascinated by a point that you made. And once you made it, it seemed so obvious. and yet it was the first time I'd thought about it, which was that the Romans held Europe together through violent conquest and did so for 500 years. And no subsequent attempt, whether it was by Charlemagne or Napoleon or even Hitler, none of them were able to replicate the same feat. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the one you didn't mention is the one that I find most fascinating, actually, and that's the Emperor Charles V in the 16th century, because he was kind of born through a kind of Game of Thrones to inherit a whole lot of small kingdoms. And then he was elected, because they did have elections of a certain sort in those days, not quite like ours, but they did. He was elected as Holy Roman Emperor.
So this is Catherine of Aragon's nephew.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there are all these relations. And of course, Henry VIII was one of the other three candidates to be Holy Roman Emperor. And just imagine what might have happened if Henry VIII had been Holy Roman Emperor instead of Charles V. So Charles V sort of started off with a deck of cards, basically, which no one had held since the later Roman emperors. And he made a pretty good fist of actually trying to get knit the whole thing back together. And he was trying to fight off the Ottomans who were coming in from the southeast. And he was flying the flag for a united Christian Europe. But he ended up fighting actually more battles against his French rival, King Francis I of France, than he ever did against the Muslim Ottomans. So, the actual defense of a Christian Europe and defining Europe in that way, it could have succeeded. It came quite close. And I think it's quite important also that Charles was the emperor when the New World was, of the Americas was conquered, in his name. And Hernan Cortes, the famous conquistador, who landed in Mexico, he did this, this sleight of hand where he persuaded the Aztec emperor Moctezuma, that he was their god who'd come back from across the sea. But he was able to do that because he could say quite genuinely that his master back home in Spain wasn't just king of Spain. He was, the universal monarch. He was the king of all of Europe, which was the kind of the world.
I mean, how is it, though, that the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor ended up sacking Rome and holding the Pope hostage for a bit? How did that all happen?
Well, this is the point. I mean, Charles was, Charles, as I say, he made the best fist of it that I know of anyone who actually tried to pull Europe together, and he just didn't manage it. And it was a bunch of French soldiers under a rival claimant to the French throne who were fighting under the banner of Charles, but not really under his control. And then their leader got killed as they were climbing up the ladders trying to break into Rome, and the invading army just ran amok, and it was actually the worst. Rome's been sacked 3 times in its history, twice at the end of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, and then in 1527 in the reign of Charles V, and it was done in his name. And that, I think, was another of the nails in the coffin to a kind of revived Roman Empire. But yes, I mean, you went to go back a bit. I mean, you said, how is it that nobody ever managed it after the Romans? And I don't know. I mean, is it that there weren't the right people? My guess is that it wouldn't matter who had been Holy Roman Emperor at that time. Charles couldn't do it. I don't think anyone could probably have done it because Europe had just changed sufficiently. It had become much bigger even than it was in Roman times, but it had also kind of dispersed. It was there was a drawing together that came together around the popes in Rome and the then Catholic Christianity, which was unified. But ever since the breakup of the Roman Empire, there had been petty kingdoms and little bits breaking off in different directions. Europeans have been fighting against each other for every bit as long as they've been Europeans. In a way, fighting against each other is part of what, sadly, defines Europeans.
I mean, is there also an element of the technological disparity between the Roman army and other fighters in Europe at the time was pretty big? And that's why, they're hemmed in by the Parthians to the east, who are pretty hot shots when they've got a horse and a bow and arrow. It takes 3 Punic Wars to deal with Carthage, in part because they've got, to be crude, a shit-hot navy, right? And the Romans have to reverse engineer from a Phoenician ship to work out how do you
That's right, because they never had a navy, and they had to invent one, more or less, in order to take on the Carthaginian.
I mean, it was just so happened that they managed to get their hands on a Phoenician ship, and they went, okay, right, let's see how this thing works together.
Yeah.
And it's after the defeat of Hannibal Barca that they sort of like wheel around, and they're like, right, come on, lads, Mediterranean's ours. But after that point, because of when Rome conquers, it also makes people more like Romans, and they fight like Romans. And I don't know, did it sort of equalize technological development to the point that after that, you're fighting people who are too much like you to be able to really hammer them?
I don't think so, because, you're right. I mean, in today's Middle East, you've got the Parthians, who actually are, they're pretty sharp shooters. And I mean, the famous, not only they don't only fight, they shoot arrows from horseback, but the really famous thing they do is they turn round in the saddle and they fire backwards over their shoulders. Hence the phrase we still have, the Parthian shot. So they were pretty formidable, and they were the big enemy that the Romans really sort of rated and put their biggest efforts in maintaining a stable frontier, which they did for hundreds of years. And then in the 3rd century of the Common Era, CE, in the 3rd century, the Parthian Empire in turn sort of crumbled, and it was retaken over by the Persians. It became an Iranian-Persian empire under the Sassanid dynasty. And then for the last centuries of their empire, the Romans were actually fighting against the Persians, who had always been a formidable enemy, because Persian civilization had always been, at least as advanced as anything in Europe at the time. But the bit the Romans, they didn't leave it undefended, but they don't seem to have neglected a bit. It wasn't superior technology, it was superior numbers. There were an awful lot of those people whom the Romans had no qualms about calling barbarians. And we tend to put in scare quotes, because we don't want to get too much just sort of stereotyping. But the Romans were pretty crude in their stereotypes. So, basically, the further you went beyond the Roman frontiers, the more barbarous became the barbarians. And you got, basically, you got a kind of more and more primitive lifestyle until you get to the sort of nomads of the Central Asian steppe. But there were an awful lot of these people. And at various times in history, we don't really know why, possibly to do with climate change, they were on the move. And beginning in the late 4th century, in 376, a whole bunch of people called Goths who'd been displaced from from today's Ukraine, actually, by Central Asian nomads.
Not from Camden Market with the black lipstick and the white face paint and stuff.
No, that I think came a little bit later. But they were probably still pretty formidable. I'm not sure they painted themselves, but they'd been displaced, and they congregated in huge numbers on the north shore of the Danube, and the Romans were on the south, and they wanted to come across, and eventually they petitioned the Roman Empire and said, please, can we come across? And the emperor said, well, okay, you can, because he was thinking, well, he was busy fighting the Persians. Let's get some extra cannon fodder. It'd be quite handy to have a few extra bods. But of course, what happened was that this bunch of displaced, rather desperate people came across. They were under pressure and then more came behind them. The Romans couldn't cope. You got, if you like, a sort of classic migration crisis. But, and I do stress this in my book, this was not like the migration so-called crisis today, where you've got groups of dispersed people or families at the most, fleeing persecution, coming in small groups, getting into even small boats. This was 200,000 men, women, and children with mounted horsemen escorting them. It was much more like, when the Goths came into the Roman Empire, I think it was much more like the American pioneers of the West in the 19th century, when there were people expanding into what was then called Indian territory, rather than it was like European expansion, not like the migration that we see today into Europe. So there is a migration story there. If you like, the Roman Empire did succumb to mass migration, but it was huge numbers that did it, and it was because these people were organized and in military formations.
Well, that's the thing, is that you said they wanted to settle, but they would fight for it if they weren't allowed to do so. And there's a wonderful moment where you say, well, there's a description of how they would fight defensively to, protect the horses and the women and the children in the middle, which is circling the wagons.
Well, the wagons, yes. And again, it sounded just so much like films of the of the American West.
I want to go back in time just a little bit, because you really begin by thinking about the Persian Wars and the Persians, the big enemy of West Asia. They sort of pop up in different forms throughout. So, there's the Persians, and then people get called Persian even when they're not. That there's a sort of idea of the Persian enemy. So how is it that the Persians were sort of framed as the big civilizational enemy to Europe? And why was the Battle of Marathon in particular so crucial for forming that narrative?
Well, from the Persian point of view, I mean, the Greeks were probably actually quite a small sideshow. The Persians in those, the heartland was Iran, and indeed there are modern parallels. But the Persian Empire in the 5th century BCE was much larger than modern Persia, extended all the way from today's Turkey right across to northern India and as far as Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, to the Caspian Sea. It was the biggest empire we think that the world had probably ever seen by that time. And the Greek city-states, perched on the edge of Europe, sort of facing that, were, they were minnows by comparison. And
that fabulous description of the Greek city-states sort of around the Mediterranean, of frogs around a pond.
Well, indeed. I mean, it was their own great philosopher, Socrates, who used that analogy, which was recorded by Plato. And indeed they did. There were Greeks in forming little city-states all around the coast, but their heartland was more or less today's Greece, which is a small peninsula sticking out into the Mediterranean on the southeast corner of Europe. And the Persian Empire had been extending, it extended right up to the Aegean Sea, which is the other part of the boundary of Europe. And then it started to, had a go basically at moving westwards into what we now call Greece. Now, Europe comes into play here because I don't know what the Persians said about this, if in fact we know, but the Greeks had a pretty straightforward view of the world. They'd drawn kind of maps, and they knew of 3 continents, and they gave them names. So there was Europe was where they lived, Asia was the other side of the straits, where the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, and then across the Mediterranean was Africa. They had a different name for it, but Africa. So you've got these three continents. So when the Persians sent this massive expedition of about 1 million men, apparently, and 1,000 ships escorting them across the straits and into Europe, the historian Herodotus, who wrote up the story afterwards, lit on the idea of presenting this titanic conflict, titanic from the Greek point of view, not the Persian one, as being a clash of continents. And so far as we know, that was really his own original idea. And he played up the idea that as the Persian king, was mustering his troops and rallying them on and so on, he's saying, what a wonderful place Europe is. It's even better than our own country. And we're going to, once we've defeated this lot, the Greeks, we'll conquer the whole of Europe. Now, Herodotus would have had a vague idea that Europe extends all the way to the Pillars of Hercules, Straits of Gibraltar, Cadiz, beyond, but he'd no idea of the bits where we live now, for example, or northern Europe. So it was really the historian's idea that this clash, this war that the Greeks had unexpectedly won against overwhelming odds, had actually been a clash of continents, Asia against Europe. And the way I tell the story, the way I figure it out, is that in telling the story that way, Herodotus quite deliberately weaponized a geographical term that was purely geographical until those days and gave it a geopolitical sense. And in one way or another, ever since those battles, Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, ever since those battles 2,500 years ago, there has always been a sense, however changeable and however uncertain in many ways, that there is such a thing as Europe, which is a geopolitical concept. It's a mixture of geography and of ideas. It's partly the facts of geography given by nature and the physical terrain, but above all, it's a human concept. It's something that people like us have dreamt into existence.
I mean, so Herodotus, very famously, father of history, also the father of lies, some people say, because he liked spicing up a story. He liked to spice up a story to make a point. And there's a wonderful detail that he adds about King Xerxes to lash the sea with his whips and to chuck iron manacles in to punish the sea for what, being rough? Or
for being rough, yeah, because the sea got up in a storm, and he built a bridge of boats across a narrow strait, and it's famously the wind blows down that narrow channel, and it all got dispersed, and he was so furious. I said, sending slaves, lash it. It's a bit like a King Canute and the waves in England, but it was more grand than that. He was punishing nature, and of course, from a Greek point of view, that's not a good thing to do.
I mean, so is this also this idea of punishing nature and the sort of overweening arrogance of a Eastern king who thinks he can overstep the boundaries of nature? There's a sort of moral story here, right? Which is like, because you think that Europe is yours, there's something unnatural about it. But as you said, the border of Europe and Asia is not clear. Like, it's not clear where that is.
A lot, indeed, and indeed a lot of later European history is about still trying to define that border, as we still are rather very painfully doing at this very moment. But there was at least a geographically clear feature, the straits between Anatolia and the Thracian part of the Balkans, and Xerxes brought his army across there. But yes, you might say it's all part of the same region, but this was part of Herodotus' explanation for how the Greeks had succeeded against all the odds. That Herodotus reckoned, or he basically wanted to encourage the Greeks to think they were defending one continent against another, and that the idea of the tyrant, as he called him, the great autocrat from Asia crossing over into Europe, this would be an abomination to the gods. It would offend the gods of the Greeks. So the Greeks were being very pious in their own world in driving the Persians out again. And so Herodotus ends his history by saying, well, the Persians went back to Asia where they'd always believed that they belonged. So all was kind of right with the world. But ever since then, the geopolitical idea that Europe is separate in some way from the rest of the huge Eurasian landmass, there's a real distinction between Europe and Asia, that idea has stayed in people's consciousness. And that, if you like, is kind of the basis of the book. That's the thread that connects it all up.
I mean, like, throughout, like, what that boundary is in terms of religion, culture, politics, race, like, it just comes up again and again and again of going, how do we invent this boundary between East and West, and the sort of shifting place in which we establish it. I mean, going forward in time just a little bit, Alexander the Great, did he want to establish a kind of ginormous Eurasian superstate? Is that the reason for him going eastwards and just sort of, ploughing his way through much of Persia, getting all the way into India? Was he like, all right, I'm going to form something which is much bigger than Macedon, obviously, but much bigger even than what we conceive of as being the Hellenistic world?
Well, one thing about Alexander the Great was that he wasn't going to do it from the air. He put boots on the ground, because that was the way you did it in those days. And he was there at the head of his armies, and he fought any number of battles and was many times wounded. And he was determined to conquer, it seems, the whole of that vast empire. There are many accounts suggesting that his ambitions were bigger even than that. I'm a little sceptical. I'm with the sort of minority of historians who argue that actually his aim was really limited to the Persian Empire. So that once he got to northern India, which is as far as the Persians had ever got, he was actually quite ready to turn back, and that he intended to come back and then set up this empire with his capital in Babylon in the Middle East. But one of the fascinating things about Alexander the Great is that we have no evidence from his own lifetime. We have no words of his own. We have hardly any words surviving really from anyone who knew him. Well, that's not quite true. We have the whole works of Aristotle who taught him. But I do wonder, did poor Aristotle, did he ever actually teach Alexander anything? I will be honest. I mean, Alexander is a world conqueror. He's a hero. He's commemorated all kinds of ways. I do not like him.
Do you consider him, a warmonger or genocidaire or idiot?
It wasn't genocide. He wasn't trying to kill whole peoples. He just wanted to rule over them. Mm-hmm. But he killed a lot of his own people. He killed a lot of his own friends. Again, his father was murdered in broad daylight in a theatre when he was present. And, again, I'm one of a minority who thinks it's actually quite likely that Alexander had a hand or more than a hand in organising the plot against his own father and getting, he was someone who, he was a kind of a real psychopath. I mean, he was determined to do better and more than anyone living. And it's quite likely that, he died at the age of 32, but by the time he died, it's quite likely he really did believe that he was a god on earth. And he got his Greek courtiers to bow down in front of him as though he was a god, and they did not like that.
Hey, you, have you subscribed to Downstream newsletters yet? If not, click the link below. And if you have, as you were. I mean, just thinking about the relevance of the term genocide for thinking about the military campaigns of the ancient world. One of my favourite podcasts, I love Mike Duncan's The History of Rome. Love it. And that's because he gets into real nitty-gritty detail. And he sort of says, if you look at the Marco-Manic Wars waged by Marcus Aurelius, or the campaigns in Gaul, right, famously not only waged by Julius Caesar, but then written up as propaganda to be disseminated back in Rome, is that these are actually genocidal wars. And I just sort of wondered what you thought about that. Is that too modern an imposition for thinking about what was happening in the ancient world?
I think, I'm always a bit nervous about, a term like genocide because it's so heavily loaded and it's loaded with particular elements of really quite recent history. In a way, I would think what the Greeks did to the Carthaginians is more like genocide. They destroyed the city, they killed all the men, they took the women and children into slavery. And I think there is a bit of a question to what extent Carthaginians as a distinct people, the city was rebuilt, but not by Carthaginians anymore. I think there were genocidal moments. The ancient warriors, ancient peoples were certainly capable of what we would call genocide. But take Caesar in Gaul. Now, we have his own account for it, that he killed somewhere over 1 million Gauls in the process of subduing the whole of today's France, Western Germany, Belgium, and most of Switzerland. And he boasts about it. But there's no suggestion that he was actually trying to kill all the people who lived there. He wasn't trying to stamp out the Gauls whose lands he was conquering. And in a way, why would he? Because, the effect of these conquests was that the Gauls became Romans. They became eventually they became citizens, but many before that were slaves. They were slaves, then they were freed, but they became citizens of the Roman Empire, which is why French people still speak a form of Latin, Latin today. So I don't think it was about actually trying to. It was trying to. I think this awful thing is trying to exterminate a people, which is I think the essence of genocide. My impression is that ancient wars tend not to have quite that totalitarian aim. It's about conquering territory and grabbing the people for your own use, to make them subject to you. Alexander certainly doesn't seem to have had any. Alexander, far from being genocidal, actually wanted to bring the peoples that he conquered together under his rule. And again, a lot of his Greek courtiers, started to look down their noses, or worse, when they saw him sort of dressing up as a Persian or giving honours to Persian nobles. Because Alexander understood, in just the way that the Romans did 3 centuries after him, the best way to rule a vast empire is actually through the people who've been ruling it already.
I mean, in the chapter about the Roman Republic, you cover the period of civil wars that end up breaking the Republic, and so you've got this era of great generals. You've got Marius and Sulla. You've got Pompey and Caesar. Is the lesson that you can extrapolate from that period of time, is it that you can have a republic, or you can have an expansionist empire being driven by a very powerful military, but not both?
Well, that's quite a question, and I think that's probably the kind of classic question that my classical colleagues would set in final year undergraduate essays. Can you have both? The Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, its institutions simply cracked under the pressures of having conquered as large an empire as they had. And the way things turned out, the only way actually to hold that together was by the stroke of genius that Augustus came up with, the first emperor, which was to institute a very strict, firm one-man rule, but call it a republic. And in fact, that term, the res publica Romana, was used right through the Roman Empire, and it continued to be used in Greek, actually, right through the Byzantine Empire, right through into our own 15th century. So it was a very powerful idea. But the res publica, the republic, didn't have to be democratic. And that was the sleight of hand that Augustus got away with, because the Romans had this absolute horror of monarchy, of one-man rule. And yet they bought into it, and then some, in the form of the emperors. And nobody after that, they constantly ousting emperors, but nobody ever questioned the form of government that Augustus had set up in the empire. So it was one-man rule, but they called it a republic.
There was this, I think is a quote that comes from Virgil, you can correct me, and it's in the voice of Jupiter, right? Imagining the, big head honcho, Tony Soprano god, saying, "For them I set neither boundary nor season, power without end of limit shall be theirs." Yeah. And so that's one part of the Roman identity. And then the other, and you get this with Hadrian, is that you have a consolidation of where the borders are. And it was kind of controversial at the time. People were like, "What are you being such a wimp for? Go further into the Rhineland. You can do it." So you had these two things of like, the world is meant to be ours, but like, here are our boundaries. This is as big as we can go. How did those two things sit together? Yeah,
actually, I think it's in the same speech that Jupiter also says to Aeneas, you conquer people and so on, but also, you're mild towards the vanquished. You bring people together. You bring the arts of peace. And the Romans certainly believed that they had brought peace to the world that they conquered. There's a famous, it was Tacitus who wrote, he put into the words of a barbarian chieftain, they created a desert and they called it peace. So the Romans knew what they were doing, and sometimes it was it actually wasn't really very nice at all. But I'm glad you pick on Hadrian. He's actually one of my heroes among Roman emperors.
Had a beard, and people thought that was
a bit weird,
super weird. He went beyond, well, this is my understanding anyway, from History of Rome podcast, so I could be wrong. You could have male lovers, but you couldn't be flaunting them. They certainly couldn't be a replacement for a female wife, and you certainly should never be the receiving partner. And Hadrian apparently was, you'd describe him as flamboyant in modern parlance.
I suppose so. One of the things I quite admire of him, he was quite a technocrat. His surviving words. We have a lot of his own words are preserved on altars and on decrees that he, been inscribed on stone. And he's always inspecting the troops and saying kind of, jolly good show, chaps, carry on. And he's checking the water supply. He's building walls all over the place. I'm not sure how maybe he did have a flamboyant side. There's a famous story of his male lover Antinous, and when he died, it kind of broke him. But also, as you say, he didn't let personal, except perhaps at the end, he didn't let personal affections get in the way of running an empire. And he was pretty thorough about running an empire, and he was the one who, he built walls around it. I mean, it seems rather bizarre today that, the one that survives is the one he built across the north of England to keep actually us Scots, because I come from Edinburgh, out.
Oh, God, didn't work for very long then,
Well,
did it?
When you think of all the threats that the Roman Empire faced, the one that wasn't really going to finish them off was the Picts from Scotland with their wild tattoos and their haggis and their strange accents. But it was the idea that you actually do set bounds around the empire. And, he built more seriously. He built a wooden wall between the Rhine and the Danube. He fortified these rivers, the banks of those rivers, as being a bound of the empire. In the Middle East, he brought a rare period of relative peace when he negotiated, actually, the Euphrates as a boundary between Roman and what was then Parthian territory on the other side. He built a whole series of forts in North Africa, along the edge of the Sahara Desert. So, if you like, Europe, the heartland, with these extensions on other continents, North Africa, Middle East, he builds. He puts boundaries around them. And you're absolutely right. Elite Romans thought this wasn't really a very Roman sort of thing to be doing. We ought to be gung-ho. We ought to be going out and conquering barbarians. But Hadrian said, no, this is how far it goes. And the boundaries that he set pretty much lasted for the best part of 300 years.
So who was right?
Well, he had a point.
He had a point. I was thinking about, kind of modern comparisons to the Roman idea of where its writ can run. And it made me think of the American idea of manifest destiny, which is our manifest destiny to, control continental North America between the Pacific and the Atlantic. And that sets boundaries, but obviously America is overstepping its boundaries all the time, as we speak in Iran. Is the real inheritor to that Roman imperial sense of both power without end of limit, but also there being some hard natural boundaries. The real inheritor of that is America rather than any contemporary European power.
Well, I mean, where did that manifest destiny come from? Washington and Jefferson and all these founding fathers, they'd read their Virgil. And not for nothing did they call their legislative building the Capitol of the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Look at the architecture of Washington, D.C. The Capitol with its Roman dome. My favourite of those buildings is the Supreme Court building, which was actually built, I believe, as late as the 1930s. But it's a huge replica of an ancient Greek temple. So the founding fathers, the idea of modern America is very much founded on the precedent of ancient Rome, with an awareness of Rome's Greek antecedents behind that. And I mean, it's not a new idea. It's been said since I think probably quite early on in the 20th century that more about Britain and America more than perhaps Europe and America. But, Britain is like ancient Greece and America is like ancient Rome. So, the one sort of rather engulfs and takes over the other. But the sort of cultural bedrock, the soft power, if you like, comes from the ancient Greeks or from us Brits. Mutatis mutandis, as you say in Latin, other things being equal, you could say the same of Europe as well. Europe is the old world because, whatever America is or has set itself up to be, it was founded by Europeans. And in many ways, the American Constitution is the most manifest and consequential result of the European Enlightenment of the 18th century. Something which actually Europeans failed to do in their own continent. It was Europeans on another continent who actually created that whole constitutional arrangement, which worked for more than 200 years. So you do wonder actually where it's going now.
As someone who's really interested in how the stories we tell about ourselves appeal to the past, so even in Herodotus's telling of the Battle of Marathon, he's talking about the Trojan War and saying, well, that's the sort of origin of the enmity between these two continents. And you said, well, that's like us talking about Anglo-French relations, yes. Basically being set by the Battle of Agincourt. I mean, if you're thinking about the period of time. Why is it that the EU chose as its capital Brussels rather than Rome or Athens? And how would it be different if they'd chosen Rome or Athens?
I don't know the answer to that question, and I jolly well ought to. I'd better find this out. The first thing that came to my mind is it was the birthplace of Charles V that we were talking about before. But I don't know if that's got anything to do with it. I think it's to do with the way the rather prosaic coal and steel community came together in the 1950s. The first really coming together of European nations was what they called the Benelux nations: Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. So Brussels was a kind of meeting point, central point for them. And then of course Charlemagne had his capital not far away in Aachen, which is today in Germany, but it's not very far away. But it's a good question actually. Why Brussels?
Because I was thinking this when I was thinking about what makes a European and what makes you feel like you are the inheritor of a cultural tradition and a story. And ironically, I feel it a lot more strongly than my white British husband does. When I was in Athens and I was at the Acropolis, I'm kind of tearfully being like, this is the birthplace of who we are. And he's like, can we just get some spanakopita, please?
Yes.
or when we're in Rome and, you see Marcus Agrippa's name above the...
the Pantheon.
Above the Pantheon. And I know that the lintel was, remade and stuff. Like, don't spoil my fun, viewers. Something about, this guy and his ambition and his statecraft being there for thousands of years, and I'm looking at it, drinking my Aperol spritz, is that for me, that makes me feel connected to this European story and a cultural tradition that goes all the way back to the Greek city-states. Whereas I'm sure Brussels is very charming. I don't think I'm going to feel that way about the home of the French fry. You know what
Which
I mean?
it may or may not be. The
not
Brussels sprout. Well, no. And also, let's be honest. Brussels in political terms, has a pretty tarnished name these days, and the whole. I'd rather deplore the whole sort of fetish about Brussels bureaucrats, faceless they are, and and how they want to take away our British sausage, and that was yes ministered rather than reality, but you know what I mean.
Curvy bananas.
Curvy bananas was it was a real one, except it wasn't.
Whereas if you're trying to talk about Athens in that term, or Rome, the eternal city, or the home of philosophy, you can't be as disparaging about it.
Well, that's true. Maybe the European Union got it wrong. Actually, we should have put because again there has been actually more serious. There has been a huge shift in sort of in political and economic power from the Mediterranean parts of Europe to the north of Europe over about 2,000 years. So it probably does make sense that the sort of most economically developed part of Europe is the north. One thing that does fascinate me, if you look at sometimes a weather map at night, they show Europe with just all the lights, or if you look at a satellite picture of the world, you can see you see the nodes of light where the big cities are, and you can see the clusters where more and more people live. Or if you look at a map, you see how tightly the big roads like motorways are packed together. And if you do look at either of those for Northern Europe, Brussels actually is kind of where it's at. It's about the brightest light in
all
that
roads
firmament.
lead to Brussels.
Kind of, in the way they once led to Rome. In the same way that, once you cross the Channel, you're looking at Britain, the same is true of London. But actually, even compared to Northern Europe, the cluster of lights around London is not as intense as it is, between Paris and Brussels and Amsterdam and Berlin on the continent. That's kind of where the motor, if you like, the motor is. But I agree. You need to have that connection with the past, and I think it's terribly important that people do. The other thing, going back to something you said a little bit before, one thing we learn from history is that however far back you look through the past, people then were always looking back over their shoulders. Herodotus looking back to the Trojan War, which is 500 or 600 years before his time, and even more distant conflicts still. And we know that other peoples do this do this too. We do define ourselves by where we've come from or where we think we've come from. And that's why I think, particularly in the dangerous and changing world we're in today, it's really important for all of us who actually do live in this continent, for whom it is home, to look at this anew, to take stock of actually where do we come from, how do we connect with Brussels, whether you like it or not, Rome, definitely, Athens, great love of mine, and all the other sort of centres of European culture and achievement throughout the centuries. Because I really don't think it matters where we were born. If we live here and we care about it, this is what defines us.
We can become Roman at the stroke of an emperor's pen.
Well, that literally happened.
Yeah.
It shows it can happen. And, hundreds of years later, people were still calling themselves Romans who had no organic connection at all to that city in the Italian peninsula. So, it does work.
I want to talk about religious identity, because religion forms a really important part of this book and the idea of Christendom. And forgive me if I'm compressing, but emperors in the line of Augustus, so, the Julian-Claudian dynasty and onwards, they could expect after they died to become gods. And after Constantine, and when Christianity becomes the state religion of Rome, you can't become God anymore, right? Last guy to do that was a Palestinian carpenter. After that, no more turning into God. But you can be, and every Christian king is a sort of viceroy for God.
Exactly.
What's the difference in statecraft between a god in waiting, right? A sort of pagan emperor, and God's man on earth?
Well, I can't really believe that these Romans took it very seriously, that their emperors were going to become gods. And, I was saying before, Alexander the Great sort of wanted to be worshipped as a god and may have believed he was a god on earth. And all the Roman emperors look back to Alexander and they kind of wanted to imitate him. But, there's a famous anecdote, I'm sure you know it, the Emperor Vespasian on his deathbed, turned to his courtiers and they're all sort of weeping around it, and he says, "Oh dear, I think I must be turning into a god." And, it's kind of, okay, we don't really believe this. But they did build temples to their emperors. They made sacrifices to them. And it was a way, basically, I think, of just worshipping the state. But I don't believe those emperors thought they were actually going to, go up and drink their nectar with Zeus and with a spanakopita on Mount Olympus. But Constantine, when he became a Christian, again, nobody knows why, how it happened. For what it's worth, my reading of the evidence is that actually he had bitten off more than he could chew. He didn't know what he'd let himself in for by becoming the champion of Christianity, because he changed not only the nature of Christianity by making it a top-down religion.
Whereas it was the religion of, slaves and the conquered and God forbid, women, Yeah,
yes. It's people, it was the common, the people, it's the ordinary people. It was, it was the ruled. And then suddenly it was the rulers who were patronising it, and increasingly, Constantine didn't particularly impose it on others, but his successors did. So it became, from bottom up, it became suddenly top down, and that changed the nature of Christianity. It became an element. Say what you like, there was an element of power, political power built into the way the religion functioned in practice, which there hadn't been before. But he also changed, as you say, the nature of the imperial role, because, Constantine, he was baptized on his deathbed, which meant, okay, no becoming a god for you. But it meant that every emperor after that is actually God's viceroy. And this, I wrote it in the book. There's a lot written about the divine right of kings, but I'm not sure whether it's generally accepted that this is quite where it comes from, but it seemed to me very clear that it was Constantine, and particularly the people who wrote the story of Constantine's conversion, who really established for all time, in Europe anyway, that an emperor or a king, any temporal ruler, was going to owe his power to the higher power above, which was the Christian God. So in that way, the emperor gained power in one sense and lost it in another. because he was always subject to a higher power.
What was the role of Islam in establishing the cultural and religious boundaries of Europe, right? Like, here's Christendom and, here's our competitor monotheistic religion. How important is Islam for setting our idea of where Europe begins and ends?
Pretty important. In fact, it's probably, since, pretty much since the death of the Prophet, it's been the almost one of the most important defining characteristics of Europe, because, from in European eyes, almost nowhere, suddenly came this, world-conquering monotheistic religion. And one of the things that seems to have, I think, is fascinating about that early stage, when, Islamic Arab armies were conquering everywhere, but it wasn't only conquest. There were subject peoples, so people who thought of themselves as Romans, right throughout the Middle East, who actually had been locked for generations in tedious, interminable, insoluble doctrinal questions about the nature of the Christian Trinity. And what exactly was the...
We're going to fix that for you. No Trinity.
And exactly, Islam simply said, it is genuinely, this is real monotheism, if you like. And I think people who just craved that not simple, but that straightforward, transcendent truth, rather than this complicated one, thought, actually, this is what we've always been looking for, because an awful lot of Christians in that part of the world did convert.
And we make conversion very, very easy. We make it very easy for people. Face east, say your Shahada, Bob's your uncle.
Yeah, I know, it's the other way that is more problematic, is it not?
Look, no one makes it out alive.
That's right. Yeah.
But it is a sort of, it's interesting to me in terms of, do you think of Islam as a religion of conquest? Or do you also think of it as a religion of immense pragmatism? You make conversion really easy, and, these, as you say, very complicated doctrinal questions, which have also resulted in, hugely painful schisms, which you go, we're not going to do any of that.
Yeah. Mm. Well, okay, but let's be honest. I'm coming from a position of relative ignorance about Islam.
So am I, and I am Muslim, so it's fine.
Clearly, maybe I'm not. So that's where we're both coming from. But I'm seeing it from the European point of view, and two things. First of all, being Roman has already come to mean to be Christian before the arrival of Islam. First, Caracalla makes all Roman subjects into Romans, and that really takes root. So everybody as a subject is a Roman. By the time of Justinian in the 6th century, we're still a century before Muhammad, or in the century before Muhammad, where he's saying, it's pretty well written up in the law court, in the law codes. If you're a citizen of this empire, you are a Christian. So the terms Christian and Roman are pretty well interchangeable. And the barbarian, the Goths are Christians as well. So that's not, but then the barbarians, the Franks, are not, but they become Christian. So what happens in Europe is that all these barbarians keep, pouring in. They're fighting men are fighting their way in. They're taking over Roman territory. They're basically lording it over the people who've lived there before. But sooner or later, and often quite soon, they become Christian. And that means they've already taken the first step towards becoming Europeans.
Well, I know I'm skipping around the schedule a little bit here, but, leaping forward in time to, 1492, this is then the big crisis for colonizers, because if you take religion over to the Americas and you convert people, does that mean they've got to be, just as human as you and have the same rights as you? You need some system which you can't really convert in and out of, and we'll call that race.
Yes. Well, okay. Well, let's just spool back a little bit, because the other thing about the arrival of Islam is that, all these tribes, they're polytheistic, and they all, without exception, they either become Christian, or like the Huns, or the Mongols later, they go away again. So people come into Europe, they become they're sort of it's all mixed race, mixed peoples, mixed languages. Doesn't matter, but they're all Christian. They've got that in common. The one people who never convert are the Muslims. So when the Eastern Empire falls and when North Africa falls, there's no going back there, because that's the difference. And the Romans might have expected that the Arabs, as sort of barbarian people beyond the frontiers, okay, they've got their wild religion, but they come and they settle among us, they become Christians like us. Doesn't work with monotheism.
So then the Moorish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, then, what does that do for Europe's image of itself? Because no longer are the Muslims over there,
Yeah, and it creates quite a ticklish problem for me writing the history the way I am, because my definition of Europe as Christian Europe, Christendom, means that actually Iberia is lost to Europe
for a bit,
for most of the Middle Ages. Though I'd be the first to say that, of course, equally, Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, is probably the most civilized place in Europe apart from Constantinople. The Muslim civilization at that time is definitely in advance of certainly Western Europe. So you might say I'm taking a partisan or a sort of it's about definition. So it's an attempt. So the way I see it is that that southwestern edge of Europe is actually lost to Europe through those centuries, and then the Reconquista, the reconquest, but Christian reconquest of Spain and Portugal in the later Middle Ages, and gradually the Muslims are pushed out of Europe. And what I see happening in that later period is it's a kind of domino effect. And it struck me actually. I remember this very vividly. It was visiting the famous mosque in Cordoba in southern Spain, where this beautiful sort of huge Muslim architecture with its arcades, and then there's a really rather brash tower in the middle where the Christians sort of wrecked a bit, put a big tower in it, and they filled it full of bling that they'd ripped off from South America, and I was just looking at that sort of palimpsest of history, the history imposed upon the Muslim civilization that's been there, and I just. Because my field is Greek studies, I'm always very aware of, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans bringing Islam into Europe from the east, and I see it as kind of domino effect that in exactly the same years in the West, the Christians are pushing the Muslims westwards, and they're being pushed westwards themselves at the other end by the Muslims. So, one of the things I argue in the book is that it's actually. It may not even be conscious, but it's a kind of movement of peoples that are being pressed by an opposing civilization from the East. It's pushing them west. They're pushing the Muslims out of Europe. Once they've succeeded in pushing the Muslims out of Europe, where do you go next? And then it's a kind of panic moment. You've actually suddenly, you look
like
around,
send this weird sailor guy west.
Where are we going? Where are we going? And I'm sure this would not have crossed Columbus's mind. Though I could be wrong about that. I don't think so. But we're being hard pressed. Let's get in the ships. Let's see where we can get to. And actually, there is, when you read, because we do have quite a lot of Columbus's words. He was obsessed with Islam.
In what way?
And not a good way, I'm afraid. But no, he had a wonderful idea that he was going to sail right round the world and complete the work of the Crusaders by taking Jerusalem from the other side. He's going to outwit the Ottomans on the other side. So no, fear of Islam and a kind of demonization of Islam is, I think, it's a mainspring of the conquest, the discoveries, both of the New World and, of course, the Portuguese going around Africa and into they then take on the Turks and the Malaysians and the Chinese and the Indian Ocean. So it's it's, I don't want to say civilizational, because that you're putting people into blocks, but it's Europeans at the very end of the 15th century. They're finally breaking out of a homeland that, consciously or not, it's under threat. They're being pushed. They're being squeezed, and You've got to go, got to go somewhere.
There's a fabulous book about this called How the West Came to Rule by Kerem Nishantjolu and Alex Anivas. And part of the argument is that the Ottoman navy, right, big, bad cats of the Mediterranean, sort of like ends up displacing Genoese capital, and it's like going westwards. And so without that interaction between the Ottoman Empire and Christian powers, you don't get the colonization of the Americas. Is part of the argument. It's an interesting book. I want to think just a little bit about the Reconquista. So, Isabella and Ferdinand. I don't know why for me everyone is, how do they relate to Catherine of Aragon? Catherine of Aragon's parents. It's the dominance of Tudors in the English educational system.
Is this all the fault of Hilary Mantel, I wonder?
It absolutely is.
Well, they're great books.
Oh, fabulous books. So you've got Isabella and Ferdinand, and you've got the pushing out of the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. You've got Columbus set on his way, and you also have the Inquisition, right? You also have this violent paranoia about secret Jews, basically.
And Muslims.
You had the expulsion of the Moriscos a bit later, I think, so who were Christian but descended from Moors. And my sense is that this is where race as a way of understanding people, this thing that you can't fully, it doesn't matter that you're Christian, you're still this other thing, is becoming quite important. And I suppose I'm interested in the difference between how Jews and Muslims are framed, right? One being a sort of civilizational threat, and the other being this kind of enemy within, and how anti-Semitism has functioned in Europe in terms of, one, defining a sense of Europeanness, how central is anti-Semitism to that, and two, its relationship to the idea of an Islamic civilizational threat.
Yeah, I'd like to take it back beyond anti-Semitism, actually, more about talk about the Inquisition, because one thing that I would say about my book is that I'm writing as a European in a way for Europeans, and I'm talking about if you like, us Europeans, and as well as people anywhere else is reading the book, but taking stock of who we are, where we came from, what our ancestors, cultural ancestors, have done. One thing I'm not doing is banging the drum and saying that Europeans have always got it right. And one of the starkest comparisons I always find is the treatment the Christians meted out to the Muslims when they reconquered Spain, as compared to the way the Ottoman Turks treated the European Christian populations whom they conquered at pretty much exactly the same time. Because the Catholic monarchs, they drove out the Jews, they persecuted the Muslims, they instituted the Inquisition for generations, because they had this absolute paranoia about anyone thinking in a way which was different from the Christian way of thinking. So that basically, by the time of General Franco, Spain must have been probably 100% Catholic Christian. Whereas you look at, the Balkans or Greece, they were conquered by the Ottomans, but the Ottomans had a much more broad-minded system in the way they treated religious difference. So their European subjects were allowed to maintain their religion. The Orthodox Church became part of the institutions of the Ottoman Empire. But look at what happened in history afterwards, because, as I said, by the time of Franco, Spain is 100% Catholic. No question there. Look at the Balkans. The Ottomans got driven out again by those same Christians who were allowed to keep their religion. If they'd been persecuted in the same way, there wouldn't have been any Christians left to be able to do it. But, so who's right? It's rather a horrible comparison. But
No. I hear your point. We will clip it up to make it sound like you're advocating for more Ottoman persecution, so don't worry about that. I want to move on a little bit to the sort of ambiguous status of Russia. And there's this wonderful quote that you select from Leibniz, the mathematician, not the biscuit, who refers to the Tsar as the Turk of the North. In some way, does that idea of this kind of unstable, contingent, difficult to classify racial identity. Does that still hold for how Russians are viewed to this very day?
Well, again, I mean, I prefer not to see it in racial terms. I'd see it in cultural terms. And Russia and Russians are in a very... They're precisely impossible to categorize clearly in those terms, because the original Duchy of Muscovy was Orthodox Christian. The Russian Empire was Orthodox Christian. As Russia expanded right across Siberia, it imposed Orthodox Christianity on the peoples, or many of the peoples of the regions that it conquered. So, as a Christian power, it ought to qualify as European, but most of it's not in Europe, and probably not any of it's really in Europe. The way I get round that kind of ambiguity, but I mean the truth is it's an ambiguity. The way I get round it is that from 1703 until 1918. The capital of Russia was in Europe because Peter the Great founded his new city, Sankt Petersburg. He even gave it a European name.
Sort of based it on Amsterdam, doesn't he?
He based it on Amsterdam. He even gave it a Dutch name, named after his own patron saint. He built it out of nothing. It was designed by Europeans. It looks European, to that extent, and during those centuries, the 18th and 19th centuries, but elite Russians spoke French among themselves. So Russians were in the process of becoming European, and at the Congress of Berlin in 1814 and 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, Tsar Alexander I of Russia is one of the big players, and everybody accepts him as being a European ruler, and you couldn't gainsay him that because he'd done the heavy lifting of chasing Napoleon out of his native land, after all. But then, come the Bolshevik Revolution, the capital moves, I would say, out of Europe, back to Asia, to Moscow, and the Soviet Empire was clearly very anti-European, so that's a clear divide. There was a kind of hiatus in the 1990s, into the noughties perhaps, when it looked as though Russia was perhaps becoming European, as it always had the potential to. And it seems to have been very largely down to, dare I say, Putin himself or the people around him. I suspect the way that American capital behaved in post-Cold War Russia also played a large part of that in making possible the kind of kleptocratic capitalism that took over. There ought to have been other ways, surely, for that transition to be managed. Because it was badly managed, Putin came out on top. But the result is we now have this, seemingly visceral and quite clearly articulated enmity from the Kremlin towards Europe. So, if you like, it's not just Europeans looking at Russia and othering Russia. Russians are doing the same to us. But one thing I would say is
we're all gay Muslims. That's the Russian narrative.
Well, yeah. But I mean, just as that physical frontier has never been stable, neither is that kind of cultural or ideological one. It has been the case in the past when Russians have been much more European than they are now, and there's no reason why they couldn't be in future.
Well, one of the things that you talk about towards the end of the book is Putin's long, very rambling essay about Ukraine. And the argument that he makes is that Ukraine doesn't really exist. It's an invention of Europe. It's always been a part of Russia, and it's intended to be a buffer between Europe and Russia, and then also a sort of springboard into Russia. In terms of Russia's own sense of where its borders are, both in the east and to the west, I guess also to the south, how does that interact with or disrupt Europe's ideas of where its borders are? And do you think that the plan is for more expansion after Ukraine? Well,
I mean, there's obvious obviously danger there, and the more this rhetoric has been ramped up on both sides, of enmity between Europe and Russia, I've no idea to what extent Putin might actually have territorial ambitions or how far they might go. I mean, the bogey, the sort of bogeyman picture is Stalin, who extended, if not quite the borders of Russia, at least Russian influence as far as the River Elbe in Germany. So you could in theory, if the opportunity arose, you could get either through satellite states or through direct conquest. It's imaginable in today's world of strongman leaders, in which it seems to be all right for any strongman leader basically trying to grab territory if it's within reach. In which case, I think Europeans have every reason to be pretty nervous about what might happen. But falling back a little bit before that, I mean, it shouldn't. I mean, that should not have happened. I mean, it's not quite the Trump argument that the war of Ukraine should never have happened. But Europe was a bit ham-fisted in the way it extended its influence into the former Soviet republics, and Putin was unnecessarily.
In terms of flirting with the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, or.
Well, I mean, the Ukrainians flirted with the idea of joining NATO. And of course, I mean, the irony of irony is that it was the US who wanted them to, and the French and Germans who said they mustn't. And the result was a stalemate. Look how these things have changed now. And the latest American, strategic document says that, NATO should not aim to expand any further. I mean, I'm pretty sceptical about the expansion of NATO for a rather different reason. That what sense does it make to have a North Atlantic Treaty Organization if you're on the far side of the Black Sea? It's the same with Ukraine or Georgia. Does this entirely make sense? But for people in all of these former Soviet republics, if they look, they look one way to Moscow, the other way to Brussels. And I think it's entirely legitimate for them to choose as independent states, which the end of the Cold War made them, to decide which way they want to go. And Belarus went one way under Lukashenko, and Ukraine went the other. Which again, if you like, at least looks like quite an untidy map of that East-West divide, but it just emphasizes that it's not a fixed thing. And I mean, again, it fascinates me to the extent to which in just about 10 years, Ukrainians, a people of whom, dare I say, people in this country perhaps knew rather little, have suddenly, emerged onto the world stage as Europeans. It matters to them to be part of Europe. And I wonder for how many of their parents and grandparents that would even have been the case.
What is a contemporary European cultural identity? Because when I'm amongst Americans, I feel European. When I'm amongst continental Europeans, I feel like a boorish Brit. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I take the bit about the boorish Brits. Yeah, we've got that reputation. Yeah.
So what does it mean to have a European cultural identity that can take, England at our backwater of the Roman Empire best, all the way to Greece, maybe even little bits of Turkey as well. What is it that can hold all these things together?
Well, I mean, for me, I suppose fundamentally, it's reading history. It's knowing that this is our story. We are the inheritors of the civilization that has built up, that has changed its boundaries, has changed its content, its beliefs, its values, and they're still changing, and they will continue to change. But nonetheless, has been for 2,500 years, there has been some kind of consensus, some kind of awareness that people who live on this promontory, on the western edge, sticking out into the sea, on the western edge of Asia, that we call Europe, ever since the time of Herodotus, have things that define them. And because definition tends to be about difference, that make us different from those who live in other places. And I would absolutely not put that in racial terms, but I would put it in cultural terms, which is why I think, again, the boundaries are open. It's not fixed. It's in flux. But what makes people European today? I mean, To put it perhaps more narrowly, one might say in terms of culture, politics, the rule of law, democracy, human rights. These are perhaps the kind of tick box, if you like, things that I would inevitably come back to. And if I have time, I mean, I would gloss each of those because, they're not as simple as they sound. When we talk about human rights, I mean, the way that term is used, and sometimes, dare I say, it can be perhaps overused today, it's got a very specific and sometimes quite narrow legalistic kind of sense, and also perhaps, excuse me, also perhaps easily separated from the responsibilities, which are the other parts of rights, historically. But when we talk about human rights, I think, for me, we're talking about an idea of the human individual that you can trace through the evolution of Christianity and Christian theology back to the Roman Empire, back to the ancient Greeks, to the idea of the unique worth of every human individual. Democracy, is invented in Europe. It didn't work that well in Europe when it was first invented, and it was pretty well suppressed for the best part of 2,000 years. So let's not bang a drum and say democracy defines Europe. It defines Europe today, but our history takes in many other things. The thing above all that I think does most effectively link the culture right through all the many phases of European history and cultural development is the rule of law. The idea that every human individual is subject to rules which are invented by fellow human beings, but which all of us equally are obliged to follow and which apply equally to all of us.
I'm interested in what you think it might take for Europe to be neither conquered by Russia nor bought by America. Because there's a quote that you open with, which is neither the West nor the East will rescue Europe. Russia wants to conquer it. America wants to buy it. Does it basically come down to we need a centralized European army of some sort? Without that, in this age of multipolarity, with the Greek city-states who can't quite get their shit together?
Short answer, yes. I think we probably do. I mean, I can't honestly see how we're going to get from here to there. But yes, as the way I see the world at the moment, I think, yes, we ought to have a European army. I even would dare to say I think we ought to have a European nuclear deterrent. Many people would not agree with that, but, look what happens to countries that don't have a nuclear deterrent. But more seriously, I think the thing that we lack is a single voice in world affairs. And the difficulty is, how do you get, Europe it's one of the great powers economically in the world today. It's one of the largest population blocks. It has among the highest standards of living anywhere in the world. We punch hugely above our weight economically and culturally. And, so much of the world actually follows intentionally or not, or even aware or not, lots of different European ways. It's hugely influential. But Europe achieved that worldwide influence through its very diversity, through constantly squabbling among, Europeans squabbling among themselves, never quite agreeing, sometimes fighting fatally and tragically against each other. But how do you harness that diversity in order that Europe today can stand up for all that accumulated culture in a world dominated by states the size of the United States, Russia, China? And I fear that the analogy that I always draw is what happened to the tiny city-states of ancient Greece. There were hundreds of them, and they fought for hundreds of years to maintain their autonomy from each other, each one defending the right to make its own rules for its own citizens. But the price of that was they could just be snaffled. They could be gobbled up by a powerful neighbor, which is what the Romans did. And the equivalent of the Roman Empire, swallowing up those little city-states. It could be America, it could be Russia. It could happen to us.
An EU nuke. Somewhere Nigel Farage is frothing at the mouth. Roderick Beaton, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.